Welcome to Teaching Truth. In the movie Chariots of Fire, English runner Harold Abrahams loses a vitally important race against Scottish champion Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell, who went on to become a great missionary statesman in China. And there's a part in the movie where Harold is sitting in the stadium at the end of the day's proceedings, drowning his sorrows, and Sybil, his girlfriend, comes up to him and says firmly to him these words: "Harold, if you don't run, you can't win. If you don't run, you can't win." You see, to run the race, to give of your best, to muster all the energy you can, and to lose, that is a bitterly painful experience. But it's not failure. And as Sybil reminded Harold Abrahams, it's not failure. For failure is refusing to run the race at all. Failure is refusing to run the race at all. Failure is refusing to step out of the boat at all. And many of us have concluded, when we read that narrative from Matthew chapter 14, that Peter was the one who failed, because Peter saw the wind, felt the waves, and he began to sink. He failed. But actually, I believe that the other 11 disciples were the greater failures, because they failed to get out the boat. Failure is refusing to get out the boat at all. That sinking feeling that Peter undoubtedly would have felt within the pit of his stomach and within his mind as the waves surrounded him, as the wind buffeted him, as he began to sink, that sinking feeling in those split seconds brought Peter to a place of action. He could either allow himself to succumb to the waves and go to a watery grave, or he could act and do something. And so what Peter did was he cried out, "Lord, save me." He acted, he cried out, "Lord, save me." That sinking feeling brought Peter to a place of action. And in our reflections today, we want just to, for a few moments, consider that sinking feeling, which we may well experience, brings us to a place of action where we perhaps need to cry out to Jesus, "Lord, help me. Lord, save me." It's a sinking feeling which Mike Pilavachi of Soul Survivor felt, as he described in a story that he wrote in the book that he published with Andy Croft, Everyday Supernatural, a story which I'm going to share with you, and of how he, in his own way, in that time of sinking, of having that sinking feeling, how he cried out to God. He writes this: "Our church hosted a retreat for church leaders. I heard that on the last evening a vicar called Bruce Collins would come with a prophetically gifted assistant. They were going to prophesy over everyone in turn. I was so intrigued I sat at the back and watched. I was quite frankly amazed. Many times they would say things to the leaders who would respond with joy and with astonishment." And Mike goes on to write that Bruce invited him 6 weeks later to come with him to a church and to share words of encouragement, to share words of prophecy, that is just simply speaking God's purposes into the lives of people. And Mike writes that as the day arrived, he started making bargains with God. Lord, if you give me just one prophecy, I'll do anything you want. And of course, he couldn't think of anything. Nothing was coming to him. And Mike writes that eventually, with a heavy heart, I left for the meeting. When I arrived, Bruce motioned for me to sit next to him, and soon the first couple were sitting in front of us, waiting to hear from God. Bruce and I prayed and waited. I was desperate. The only thing that came into my mind was the song Dancing Queen by ABBA. The more I tried not to think of the song, the more the lyrics pounded in my skull. Bruce shared with the couple, and then he turned to me and said, "And what do you have, Mike?" I knew that if I said nothing, then I would never have the courage to say anything, more in fear than in faith. I looked at the pastor's wife and mumbled, "I wonder if the Lord wants to say to you, in the words of ABBA, you can dance, you can drive, having the time of your life." I felt a complete fool. The couple started laughing and I was ready to walk out. Then the wife said this: 3 weeks ago, I started a dance group in my church for the worship times. And as we were driving here tonight, I said to my husband, I'm going to cancel the dance group. What was I thinking of even starting it? I shook my head and said to him, I can't dance. I can't dance. And Mike writes this, that I was totally shocked. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that God would want to speak using the lyrics of a Swedish pop group. God can speak and God can use even the words of ABBA. And Mike went on to write that the main lesson I learned is that you never know if it's God until you say it. Sharing a word is always a risk, but I've learned just to go for it. And Mike had that sinking feeling in his mind and in his heart. I was desperate, he writes. And yet in that moment, God, as it were, stretched out his hand to Mike. Mike cried out, Lord, save me. Lord, help me. He had that sinking feeling. And God stretched out his hand. He brought him to a place of action. And Mike stepped out, yes, more by fear than faith, but actually in doing so, blessed that couple in ways beyond what he could have even asked or imagined. That sinking feeling may well bring us to a place of action, to a place of decision, where we can decide whether to act or not, when we can decide whether to, as it were, grab Jesus' hand or not, when we can decide whether to shout out, Lord, save me or not. And here's the thing, that when we decide to act, to reach out our hand to Jesus, Jesus grabs our hand. Jesus provides us with that reassurance, with those words that we need, with that confidence that we are lacking. That sinking feeling that we may well be experiencing is there because Jesus wants to use it to bring us to a place of action, of trusting in him, of taking his hand, and of going for it. Are we desperate today? Do we need to cry out to God? Do we need help? That sinking feeling brings us to a place of action. Will we reach out and grab Jesus' hand because he will save us and he will not let us down.